Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Frans. Frans, for everyone out there listening who might not know who you are, can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there?
Yeah, hello, this is Frans van der Dank speaking. I'm a Dutch citizen who is both a professor of space law at the University of Nebraska in the United States, which is an academic position. And I am also the director of my own consultancy called Black Holes, which advises in the same subject matter, which is space law and policy.
You have a lot of good space names. That's a good name for like a personal law firm, I would say. But with space law, can you educate me more about that? Because immediately I start I have a lot of questions. Are they based on moral things as well too, like ethics when it comes to responsibilities? Is like not every single person can own the moon, and the moon shouldn't be entitled to any other country. But I started kind of diving down this rabbit hole because I've talked to a lot of people who study space, who are interested in space colonization ideas about that, also UFOs, and never even thought about the law side to that. Ethics, I would think, would be the first thing. Is like I said, someone can't just own the moon, but a lot of people would try.
Yeah, well, ethics is only one part of law. We should never forget that, of course, one role of the law is to create some form of justice and fairness, which is basically compliance with ethical standards, whatever they may be. But another, and probably in practice even more important role, is just to create some sense of foreseeability and predictability. I mean, there's no inherent ethical superiority in driving on the left-hand side of the road as compared to the right-hand side of the road, but you need to make a choice in order not to create chaos on the roads. So a lot of law is not only about justice. Some of the law is not even about justice or fairness or ethics. It's just about, okay, what can we expect from each other?
What
And if you then talk about space law, obviously it's the law relevant for human activities in outer space.
what are the top concerns of that? Like, what would be like the biggest concerns that laws would be, I guess, made in the basis of like dealing with issues with space? Would it just be asteroids? Like, I'm just looking at things that would be like a more of an Earth concern. But if we talk about expanding outwards, like where does the concern face?
Well, if you want to talk about the Earthwards part, one major problem is, of course, space debris, space junk, which is the more sort of colloquial term you may use, which is, growing by the day, which may present risks to many space activities, which are now crucial for our societies on Earth. Think about communications or positioning and navigation, the use of GPS, the use of remote sensing. There are all sorts of security applications in space, and all of those depend upon satellites, and those satellites should not be hit by pieces of floating space junk. And so that's one problem which is very important if you look at the sort of down from space. If you look the other way and you look further into space, you already basically mentioned it. One of the major problems is, how does humanity address the potential colonization of outer space by humankind? And I use colonization by inverted commas because if you use it as a legal term, you should realize that that's not appropriate. There is no legal colonization of space, precisely because nobody can own any part of outer space. We've done away with that on Earth since the Second World War. The UN Charter prohibits colonialism, and a treaty of 20 years later has sort of made it very clear that that same rule applies to outer space as well. So if you use colonization in the practical sense, the term in the sense of humans going out there and settling on the moon or on Mars or on asteroids, that type of colonization is perfectly allowed. I, again, prefer to call it settlement or habitation. And then, of course, that raises issues. To what extent is that allowed, and to what extent gives that right over the resources or the resources on those celestial bodies, which is space mining.
Okay, before we get to space mining, is a lot of this happen to do with just problems that are hypothetical? Like, I feel like that's when you're establishing a law in the first place. You have to think of every possible scenario, but there's so many scenarios that I can think of that lead into another. Like, that has to probably be one of your biggest problems out there is managing at scale when you have so many different minds that are thinking in so many different ways.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And obviously the law, I mean, there's some theoretical lawyers who like to think about theoretical problems, but in reality, law really only becomes an issue, certainly at the international level, once there is a real problem. And space law basically started to be taken seriously the moment in 1957 that humankind sent its first human-made artifact into outer space, which was Sputnik 1. So the law doesn't try to run too far ahead of the issues. And the one reason why legal issues about human habitation on the moon and space mining are now discussed in a legal context is precisely because they are on the short-term horizon, with the Artemis program of the United States, with many competing programs in other countries, with the European ideas on a moon village. There is a potential for using the resources on the moon, and this then leads to, you know, who is entitled to use those resources, under what conditions, etc., etc. So that's where the law comes in.
Now, when a country, for instance, if they go up into space, let's take the moon, for example, and they place a flag there, that does not mean that they can build a settlement there, sure, but that does not mean that they own the rights to that planet or that.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
I,
And the US, back in the 1969-72 framework, and when all the US Apollo astronauts did land on the moon and did plant US flags, they were very clear, and NASA and the US government were very clear that this could not mean that they actually wanted to claim part of the moon. And they went out of their way to make that point.
But what about like if they decide to go into mining? If they decided to mine that area that they placed a flag, now that materials that is taken from that area, you could say, yes, that is rights to you. But doesn't that affect something, especially something where it comes to the moon, even though as big as it might be, it's not the size of Earth. It's not something that we're going to like, if someone mines over in their country, we're not going to probably notice it in another country. But with the moon, there's it's a whole different landscape. It's a whole different thing where you start wondering, are those resources free to mine? You be mining something if you were going to choose to eventually mine the moon or mine something of an asteroid, for instance, just because at 1 minute it might be in your above your orbit, which you don't own space. It's kind of a free range. But even if it's right above your place and there's implications, you have to worry about other countries of where that asteroid, if it does enter our atmosphere, hit.
Yeah, no, that's true. But we should realize that the moon, from the perspective of creating change in its orbits or something like that, is still far too big. So that type of concern plays mainly when it comes to asteroids, who can be as small as just a few skyscrapers taken together, floating through outer space. So that's where that issue comes from. Nevertheless, it is an issue, and the main problem from a legal perspective is that while we did agree in that 1967 treaty that I earlier referenced, which is called the Outer Space Treaty, which is kind of the framework for outer space, and everyone has signed up to that, and not just the United States, but also China and Russia, and everyone who is in outer space has agreed to that rule. That 1967 treaty only provided for the absence of legal colonization of outer space. So the US flag, which was planted 2 years later, could not mean that the moon became US territory. Everybody was clear about that. What was not clear was, going into your question, what does it mean for the actual mineral resources in the soil? And because nobody in 1967 already thought about that theoretical possibility, at least not in terms of thinking you need some laws to address that, the question is now open for interpretation. And basically you have two interpretations. You have one interpretation which says, well, since the moon belongs to everyone, all the minerals in the moon also belong to everyone, or at least to all the states combined. So the exploitation thereof is only allowed if you have some sort of international regime, an international licensing system. That's one interpretation, which some states adhere to. And other states, including the United States, Japan, the United Arab Emirates, and Luxembourg, have said, no, 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 you should better compare it to the high seas, which is also not an area that any country can claim. But you can take the fish out of there, and once it's in your nets, you can start making money with that. So that is a different interpretation, and both of them, in theory, are possible because the original treaty text didn't really address that consequence. So that's where we are right now.
I'm already getting anxiety talking about this. It's just there's so much other things out there that you got to think of. Like another example would be like, let's say we have an asteroid and someone decides to go mine that asteroid. Now that if it's only your resources that are involved in going to go mine that asteroid, then I sure think that the resources that you pull out are yours. But the exception is what happens if it's something that's more valuable and a new thing that we have never ever encountered here on Earth. Then you're going to have people that are going to raise an eyebrow at that and wonder if that should just be strictly yours, even though you spent all the resources to mine that. I mean, are these things you
Absolutely.
guys are thinking of?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the conflict. And I mean, you have kind of a little bit of a precedent when it comes to deep seabed mining, which in the 1970s, 1980s seemed around the corner, where there were these manganese nodules, these very rich metallic nodules on the deep seabed floor, which was at the time by treaty pronounced to be the common heritage of mankind. And the general idea thereof was that all these manganese nodules on the deep seabed were so unique, were so valuable, were in an area which belonged to no state. So those nodules also should be shared between the community. But then the flip side, which you also mentioned, comes up. Well, what about if only a few countries or a few companies are willing and able to spend the money and they have the technology to actually go there? Do you think they will do that if they then have to share the proceeds with the rest of humankind? And the obvious answer is probably no. So that's kind of the two polar tensions which then played in the seabed context, but are basically in essence the same as now playing in outer space. Although I should add that the position whereby those who invest should be entitled to reap the benefits is gradually winning, I want to say. So probably if we look back at this episode 10 years from now, we may come to the conclusion that the analogy to this deep seabed is not the right one, that the analogy should be to the high seas, where, as I said before, you are allowed to take the fish out as long as you comply with, in the case of the law of the sea, laws on overfishing and the prohibition on whaling and pollution and stuff like that. We have some similar laws as how you should behave appropriately on the moon. As long as people comply with that, the general idea, and again, this is winning ground, although we are not there yet, the general idea is that then you are entitled to reap the benefits from your investments and make money with whatever you mine.
Now, are these written down laws? Like, are there set ground rules in like a book that holds all these laws, or a lot of these kind of like the nuclear policy of mutual shared destruction? Is it something like that where everyone's kind of just agreeing that like, yeah, that's not ethical if we do that?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. This treaty that I reference, which forms the baseline of the discussion, is clearly black letter law. It's a written treaty. Everyone can look it up. It's the official version, or it has 6 visual language version: English, French, Arabic, Chinese, Russian, and Spanish, if I'm talking off the top of my head. So everybody can look up exactly what the treaty says. Now, the problem is, in particular, also in this context, that what it says is not any more sufficiently clear to solve the legal issue. And that's where the other part comes in, where you talk about policies, about policy statements, or about unilateral actions. Those 4 countries I mentioned just a while ago, the United States, Japan, United Arab Emirates, and Luxembourg, I named them specifically because those 4 countries have already on a national level created laws which basically say, as far as we are concerned, if you get a license from us and you comply with all the licensing requirements in terms of safety and security and not creating a big mess on the moon, you are good to go. So that is an expression of the legal sense of those 4 countries, that one interpretation is the appropriate one. Others take a different view. Others are either against and make policy statements whereby they claim that this is illegal or inappropriate or not in the sense of the spirit of the treaty. There are also a number of countries who are a little bit more careful in their policy position, so they make claims that we should arrive at some form of international regime before we can actually allow for any such exploitation activities to take place. And many of those policies are, of course, also found on paper, but they are not law. Policies are not the same as law. Law is binding. You can invoke before a court or a tribunal, whereas policy is much more fluid, is an intention of states to act in a certain way, etc., etc. And there's a very complex relationship, but they're not the same.
Now, because I would have to think that all these would have to be established by like a global organization. Is everyone invited to the global organization type deal, or is this just people that have space capabilities so far, and then you get a seat at the table when you do develop space capabilities? Because I start wondering if a country wants to decide a law or a policy or something like that and implements it, that would have to go through a voting process between amongst the whole organization, not just because they said now that they have space capabilities means that we all have to follow it.
No, but you have to distinguish between national law. Every state, every sovereign state has the full right to establish a law saying things about the type of space activities that are legal in that particular country, to what extent the state will impose certain licensing requirements or liability related requirements, or maybe even prohibiting it. That is all within the sovereign remit of individual states, but that only applies to that state and activities conducted from that state. So there, every state can basically do what they want within certain limits that we don't need to go into. The other part is that if you talk about what is allowed in space, of course, no single state can determine that, precisely because space belongs to no single state. So that's where all states together have to create rules of the road or binding legal, and that's where treaties come in, which determine what is okay, what is not okay, what is prohibited, what is required, etc., etc. And these states usually use the United Nations, and then I'm coming to your international body, as a kind of a platform to discuss these things. And the Outer Space Treaty, which I mentioned a couple of times, was sort of concocted by a number of member states of the United Nations, who gathered together annually and started to discuss these issues and came up with a draft text. So in that sense, you can say that this treaty and some others that followed on later came from the bosom of the United Nations. On the other hand, you should realize how that process works. It's not for the UN to say, okay, now we have this treaty and now everybody has to abide by it. The sovereignty of individual states still allows them to decide then, okay, I like this treaty, I agree with its remit, I am willing to undertake the obligations that it imposes, and I want to enjoy the rights that it gives, so I sign up to it. If a state doesn't sign up to it, the baseline is still that that treaty doesn't apply to that state. Now, luckily enough, the Outer Space Treaty is ratified by everyone who is someone in space. And going back to your other question, within the United Nations, there is a committee that does discuss these issues. And though you have to show some level of interest in space, it doesn't really mean that you have to have your own launch site and 20 satellites up before you qualify. It's a political process, but to give you an idea, we've just reached the 100 member state mark of that committee, which is slightly over half of the world's countries to start with. So the threshold is not like you need to be a major spacefaring nation. If you show some interest, you're allowed into the table. So you're allowed to contribute to discussions to new legal laws. But again, going back to what I said earlier, before these legal laws then would actually apply to the big countries, those big countries need to sign up to them. So small countries can become member of the UN. They can propose beautiful laws. But if the United States and Russia and China and India and the United Kingdom and all the other big guys decide not to ratify it, it remains a dead letter.
Are there punishments set in place for breaking a policy or a law that is set in place? Like, I'm not talking about just a fine. I'm talking about like there are some categories in laboratories where you can't research something for a period of an extended amount of time. Is there anything that happens to do with that with space? You can't practice space or any of that type of stuff for a certain amount of time if you break this policy.
No, not really. That's one of the shortcomings of the international legal system. Most treaties, or many treaties, do have their own system as part of the treaty obligations of sanctioning. But if the states signing up to the treaty don't want a sanctioning system, then it's not there. So what it boils down to is that if some state clearly violates the rules of a space treaty, and that basically applies to any international treaty. Think about what Russia does in the Ukraine and violating the sovereignty of a sovereign member state, which violates the UN Charter, etc., etc. The only thing you can do is, certainly when it comes to bigger states, is use that as a political tool. There is no world court which has automatic jurisdiction and then can say, Russia, you violated the sovereignty of Ukraine. Here's the punishment. You have to give up certain parts of your country. You have to pay for all the damage that you've done to Ukraine, and so on and so forth. The same thing happens in space as well, which means, of course, that the bigger states are able to get away with more than the smaller states. If a small state violates space law, it essentially is still a political issue, but probably some of the bigger states will say, well, you don't behave along the lines that space law requires, so we will not work with you anymore. We will probably boycott you. And for a small state, that's a sanction that they will probably not be able to handle. So they will sort of turn around and follow the law. But the bigger you are, the more likely you are able to sort of neglect this political backfire if you think it's important enough, and you still continue to do what you're doing.
Now, is there anything to be able to make it more of an even platform rather than if you just have the most resources or most amount of power? Because it seems like it would be unfair to be in like a race between a 15-year-old and a 4-year-old. You know what I mean? Like, not saying that in any country's at the maturity level of a 4-year-old, but just saying resource and intelligence wise, when it comes to an aspect of the amount of information that they might have or how access their civilization or country is. I mean, we all know there's countries that are way more advanced than other countries. And just because someone is able to now have space capabilities, does that mean you have to handicap them, or should we make it an even platform?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, and that's probably a little bit of an open door, but life is unfair. And I mean, the fact that some states are more powerful than others, just as some people are more intelligent than others, there is fairly little you can do about that as a baseline. It also has to do with size. Some countries have hundreds of millions of people. Some countries have only a few thousands. How are you going to even out that? How are you going to make it fair distribution, even if you politically might get sufficient willingness to achieve that? That is an impossibility. So the only thing we can do is at least put some boundaries around what can happen, boundaries to which even the strongest countries would have to comply, maybe hopefully out of a sense of justice and fairness, but even if that doesn't work, then out of a sense of, okay, we don't want to antagonize the rest of the world, and there should be room for all of us. And to be honest, law is just one tool in the toolbox of making that happen, because at least in theory, the law applies to everyone. Law is blind in that sense. That unfortunately in the real world, it doesn't always work that way, I think shouldn't keep us from trying to promote the law, because if it would be even worse if there would be no law at all, because then it would be really the laws of the jungle. And at least in outer space, there's still a modicum of allowing everyone. And yes, you need to build up your expertise. You need to have some money, although as space technology becomes cheaper and more widely accessible, you see smaller and smaller countries and poorer countries, starting their own space program. It's not like 50 years ago when only a few superpowers could afford to go into outer space. You have many African countries who now realize that they can benefit from certain, well thought parts and sectors of space activities, and that it is even worth putting in some money there, perhaps not on your own, but why not in a collective manner? So again, the best tools to at least minimize this inequality. There will always be inequality, but at least to minimize it and keep it within reasonable bounds, so that even the smaller and the weaker countries have a sense of being part of humanity, have a possibility to benefit to some extent, using the law, using international cooperation, allowing others to join, etc., etc.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to toss out a bunch of like hypothetical questions at you. I'm just trying to think, because the lines are easily blurred, I would say, when it comes to ethical like things. When it comes to just going like space, like if you're on Earth and you're talking about different, like what we just talked about, there's ethical things right there, like, not to pick on or take advantage of. But then if we go up into space and we go, let's say if a country does decide to make a settlement. Now, that settlement, don't you think, should be also not, it might just be mainly theirs, but it also should be open access as well, too. Not with the amount of information, but let's say an issue arises where another place needs to use their base because theirs is losing oxygen or has some type of malfunction to it. Now, that comes from the good gracious of, just being a good person and not wanting people to wrongfully die. But in a sense, if you have like, if Russia's base is up there and you have Ukraine people needing help, are they going to be so willing to accept that? There's an ethical issue that arises there because of conflicts that are happening out on Earth. And these become problems that you have to face because you have to work with this space law, where we start going into this idea of, I know everyone has, you see the sci-fi movies of this idea of like a world organization of like, oh, Greenpeace, whatever you want to call it. But it leads down into real seriousness when you start looking at an aspect of human life. And just because you're having conflicts and different aggressions arise, to take the moral high road, which is accepting. And I feel like that should fall under a law.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And it's interesting that you started by pointing, for example, to access and to support. Well, those are actually two principles that are enshrined in the Outer Space Treaty and some of the follow-on treaties. So again, legally speaking, if there is a part of the freedom of states to be active in outer space is creating a settlement or a station on the moon or celestial bodies, but another part is also for other states to be in principle entitled to visit that, and to reasonable safety precautions need to be taken. It can't be that somebody's knocking on the door and you immediately have to open up, because then there may be bad things happening because of the brutal environment that you're in. But there's a principled right enshrined in the treaties to visit the space stations and habitats of other countries. And the other thing, there's also a very fundamental obligation that if an astronaut is in distress, everyone who is capable of doing so should come to the rescue. There's this famous movie, I forgot the name, where I believe Sandra Bullock and George Clooney, I haven't seen it, that's why I'm not sure, but are in outer space and their space station gets blasted and they seek rescue
Gravity.
on a Chinese space station.
The movie's called Gravity. I haven't seen it either, but I know the movie.
Okay. Well, there is a rule, there's actually a whole treaty which tries to impose upon the member states, and both the US and China, and again Russia and most of the other countries signed up to this, that you should indeed basically go out of your way to come to the rescue of others in outer space. One problem is, of course, is that the law may be perfectly beautiful and setting out the ethical principle. If somebody fails to meet it, what happens? And that goes back to what we discussed earlier. Another issue which is currently playing is that these rules were again drafted in the late 60s with the idea that astronauts and cosmonauts, which is just a Russian name for astronauts, but as I said, the Russian version of the treaty is equally authentic, that cosmonauts and astronauts were seen as envoys of mankind. That was actually the term the treaties used. So they were there basically risking their lives, doing these very dangerous exploration activities in order to help humanity find out more about Earth, about the universe, about where the moon came from, where life came from, and all these things. So that was what entitled them to this special status and to sort of enjoying the benefit, to the extent that it makes sense, that of every other country being required to come to the rescue if they were able to do so. Now, another problem is that we now see people going up in outer space who do not do that for some lofty, ethical, highly moral purpose of enhancing the scientific knowledge about the universe, of humanity, or finding out about climate change and being able to do something about it. Who are going there just because they have the money to do it, the space tourists. Should those people be given the same elevated status as astronauts?
That's a good question because that's now a recent. I wouldn't say it is a problem. To me, it's a problem. I don't know. I feel like if you have enough money, you shouldn't just be like, oh, I'm gonna go and ride the space shuttle. Like I didn't like William Shatner going into space or above the atmosphere, whatever they want to say, only because they did it because he's famous. I'm like, look, you have to go through a lot of training to become an astronaut, and I think it was Neil Armstrong said that he didn't like the common person going up there because of how much work they put in there to become an astronaut. And I agree with that in a sense. Space is, I feel like, for everyone, but it should take some restrictions and also some things that go in there as well too. Mostly at least training. At least you should undergo some of what the astronauts have to go to make sure your body can handle it, right?
Right.
When where do you find, I would say, not maybe problems that you face, but more personal issues that you have with just space law in general? Have you came across anything that you might have some personal issue with?
No, I mean, as a lawyer, you have to be sort of impartial, objective, in the sense that you have to um, distinguish between the law as it is, which is a matter of analysis, following well-established principles about how a treaty clause should be interpreted. Now, having said that, of course, there are a lot of open-ended parts or vague principles which you then suddenly have to apply in a specific context, where inevitably your own ethical or political perspective comes in. But at the same time, you should be very much aware. So I think it's very important as a space lawyer not to take space law personal, not to engage in space law because you feel slighted as a person or because you have a certain political agenda you want to push. Apart from broader and more or less generally accepted ethical principles, although we should be careful there as well. We in the West, if we think about ethical principles, we think, for example, that individual sovereignty and the supremacy of the individual and freedom of thought is one of the highest ethical values. I'm sure if you think about it, you realize that there are major parts of the world where the official philosophy is not exactly that, where the official philosophy is that the individual is sort of not superior to, but inferior to the interest of the community, of the mass, and there follow a lot of things from that which relate to freedom of expression, etc. That for them, that's the ethics those countries want to pursue. So you always have to be careful that even if we talk in the West about certain ethical principles as underlaying the foundations of the law, that they may not be shared across all parts of the world. But having said that, obviously, I am who I am. I've grown up in the Netherlands. I've grown up in a Western society where the rights of the individual and the possibility to make, to decide on your own destiny to a considerable extent, it's certainly far from 100%, obviously, for a number of reasons, but at least is considered a very high value. So inevitably, if I look at gaps of the law or where the law is vague or unclear, I tend to take that lens to say, well, this is then how it should actually develop. But you always have to be careful not to push that too far because, again, law shouldn't reflect my particular ethics only.
See, that's what gets me is those gaps. I start to wonder with these laws that are in place, how many countries or how many people have found loopholes to be able to do something that might not that you might see and be like, that's not right. But they'll be like, actually, if you look at this, I mean, is that a common problem that you face? Is that there's some things like I feel like you have to keep this is something like a law, for instance, a law is set in place. Now, most of the time laws don't need to get amended, but at the same time, I also think laws should be adjusted and added
Oh yeah,
on
oh
top
yeah.
to as well.
Well, that exactly, and that's a continuous process because even if you look only at the West, ethical values change. If you look at back at society in Western Europe or the United States 100 years ago, a number of the ethical values which were clearly ruling back then are now no longer acceptable. Think about the man-woman relationship, or the relationship between the white people and the people of color, which, you know, back in the days was totally different from now. And not only was it totally different, it was at the time considered ethically okay by most people. So we should always see the relevance thereof, which is one reason why, even though laws are not as easily amended as policy, policy you can change from one day to the other. That's why I call it fluid. One of the benefits of the law, and that also has to go back to that other role of the law as you know, creating foreseeability and predictability, is that you can't change it on a whim, which means that if there is a massive ethical change in the general consideration of what is ethical, it takes some time for the law to catch up, because we don't want to change the law just for the whim of the day and then need to change it back the next day because there's another whim coming in. So that's why you have to take some time, but that also means that the law sometimes lags behind new ethical developments. But that's a struggle that you're always in. The law usually has its own mechanisms for amendment. Every treaty, almost every treaty, has a couple of articles which you know, dictate how you can change clauses of the treaty. It also allows states after a certain period to step out of the treaty if they really can't agree with that, because they've changed their ethical perspective, for example. And if all the states party to a treaty agree, then the treaty, you know, falls flat on its face, and the same countries can then create a new treaty which reflects the new ethical insights or the new political insights. So that is a continuing process, and that's why I think you will never have you know, you will always need to have lawyers who are aware of the mechanics of changing the law in an appropriate and procedurally correct fashion.
Now, when it comes to two pathways of the direction of space settlement or space war. I know I say war and you can kind of like it can kind of be scoffed at in a sense, but there's a real thing of weaponry being brought into space. And whether it's a satellite that can be weaponized, I mean, space is already technically weaponized if you look at satellites in a sense, but I'm talking about actual weapons being leaked in there. Is there two different directions that we're kind of heading towards? Now we can talk about a global peace space settlement type thing where we're just settling and we're expanding out, or we can look at the destruction aspect of things where you're really seeing us take two steps forward and three steps back, which is I mean, that's a real possibility. I've talked to some at least astrophysicists that will always talk about space colonization. It's funny because my interest in the space law, where I came across it at first, was dealing with so many people in the UFO community. All they do is talk about aliens are coming down. It's like, what about this side of it? Like, I didn't even think about this side. And it really boils down to that as well, too. But I've talked to so many astrophysicists that'll talk about space colonization and, colonizing or settlement. And that got thrown off the board when someone mentioned space has been weaponized. There's not really an aspect of settling. And it's like, yeah, you have two directions that you could be heading in. I mean, the same grounds on Earth doesn't mean the same thing in space. We're going to hope that it translates over, but so many people can try and find a way out of that type thing. That's why we have policies and laws set in place. But I look towards more of the aspect of, it's so hard to get over that personal ego in a lot of sense, where people just want to feel like they got more out of the deal than less. And it's not equally distributed when it comes to power and when it comes to resources. And I don't think it's ever going to be, but you can have agreements upon such. And I'm not looking for a perfect world. I'm not looking for a perfect space, but I'm hoping that the human species isn't just going to, I guess, fumble one of the biggest touchdown passes, which is the fact of expanding more outwards into space. Maybe I'm hopeful thinking or young mindset, I would say, but I mean, that's not, I don't think out of the realm of possibility. I'm just hoping that we're headed more towards that direction than, a destruction aspect.
Absolutely. I can only agree with that. And I don't have a crystal ball either, so I don't know which way it's going. Um, obviously, I think it's fair to say that over the last 5 to 8 years, the international geopolitical climate has worsened considerably, so that the likelihood that any activities in outer space will trigger competition instead of cooperation, and competition may, on a bad day, evolve into actual conflict, which may then bring in, armed conflict and quote unquote war in space. The chances have become bigger, larger over the last, last decade, or whatever the exact time frame is. Unfortunately, so. Still, it is far from a certainty. We shouldn't only talk in doom scenarios. There are certainly a lot of other, reasons which would point to in a different direction. Although, again, this current time frame probably is not the most fruitful one for that. But that doesn't mean that it can't happen. At the same time, we should be aware of the dangers. And again, I think as a lawyer, that law is one of the tools that, at least to a certain extent, confine the issue. I mean, the fact that we haven't had any land grab in outer space and haven't had any conflict in outer space during a long Cold War was partly due to the fact that both the then Soviet Union and the United States agreed that it was ultimately better not to have that, and also were willing to enshrine that in a number of treaties. The Outer Space Treaty was only one of them. There were more treaties in the 60s and the 70s, which talked about disarmament and gradual building down of arms control. And those were, even though the Soviet Union and the United States, wherever they could, were trying to pull one on the other, and we're trying to get third countries in their camp as opposed to the other, and we're trying to show the rest of the world that they were the superior political philosophy. They were at the same time able, on a rational basis, to say, well, we still need to avoid conflicts, and we need to put that down in writing, and so that we can show the rest of the world of our sincere intent to do that. And that's certainly not been the only reason why we have so far avoided any conflict in outer space. But at the same time, I hope it's part of that. And maybe we can, help that survive into the future. Who knows?
What about with the amount of, I guess, people going out into outer space, different countries, various countries? Could there be a grounding policy that's set in place where a country, if it has a dispute, an ongoing dispute, let's say Russia with Ukraine right now, Russia can't go into space then. You can't, because you right now have a dispute going on here on this planet. Now, a lot of countries will be like, well, yeah, we're not going to make our resources more bare by sending one out, but people still will do so later down the road. We don't know how advanced it's going to get. So I start wondering if there's a grounding policy. If you have a dispute going on Earth, you can't just go into space, in fear that it would translate over and turn into a space thing as well, too.
No, the short answer is no. That has never been the approach back in the 60s, when these foundational treaties were drafted. On the contrary, freedom for every country to go into outer space is basically still the baseline of space law. And you can't ground a country because that is not in the law. And obviously, if you now think about proposing a new country, you might be pretty sure that Russia is not going to sign up to that, to quote your specific case, which means that Russia, going back to the nature of international law, is not bound by that treaty. So that is, I'm afraid, a no-go. The only thing you can do is try to make it more unattractive for Russia by going into outer space, by refusing to cooperate with them. And by general, I mean, economic sanctions mean, of course, that the Russians are less and less able to run their economy. And it's then their choice whether they will save on food for the population or whether they will save on their space program. You can't force that in a direct sense. So I'm afraid that's a no-go area, simply because we don't have a world government or anything like that.
That's what scares me, is that a lot of this has been done on like a wing and a prayer, I would say, of just, I mean, sanctions work. Yeah, I'm not saying that they don't, but like I don't know, like with like Putin, for instance, the sanctions that are on him right now. I mean, are they working? He's still doing it. It's just like a thing of like, if a person gets pissed off enough to just keep on going, I mean, where does the line get drawn? I mean, I just start worrying about this because we're only going to advance as a society. I mean, advance maybe not mentally, but advance when it comes to weapons or when it comes to all these other things, where you start wondering, how good are these sanctions going to be in 10 years? How good are these things going to be in 15 and 20 years when people become more sustainable with renewable energies or wherever the board goes? And it start leading into, I guess, more hypothetical fears, I would say. But I mean, I just don't want that. I want there to be more of like my own personal one. I can't really put into this, but when I'm saying I don't want more destruction in a place that really has not been discovered and it probably won't ever be fully discovered, just because of the vastness of it. Because that will leak
Well,
out onto other planets.
the only way to get that to get a really is to include the Russians, as long as they still have the capability of going there. Which means that you have to agree on rules on how to behave in outer space with regard to not destroying places, from not destroying Neil Armstrong's footsteps to not destroying the possibilities to do science. You can only create that by international consensus, at least including all the countries that are major spacefaring nations, that are actually able, if they want bad things to happen, to step on Neil Armstrong's footsteps or to destroy scientific evidence on the moon. So there is no two ways about it. And of course, again, you say you don't want a perfect world. Well, that would be a perfect world where everyone would be on the same page on that sense. But then we would already have a much smaller set of problems on Earth as well. So in that sense, and be careful what you wish for. If you think about an international sanctioning mechanism, which would now slap sanctions on Russia because of the atrocities that it's doing in Ukraine and all the the injustice that it's committing there, how do you see that happening? In the West, we are generally on the same page now. But we've seen that China, for its own political interest, and because it takes a totally different view on geopolitics, and it doesn't see Russia as the major danger, it sees the United States as the major danger, if not perhaps to world peace, at least to its own ambitions in major parts of the world. So China doesn't join the sanctions, doesn't join for the time being the bad mouthing of the Russians. So does India. So do a lot of other countries which are not within the Western atmosphere. So if you really would have a world government which somehow would represent all the peoples of the world, maybe we would be at the bad end of the stick, because there would be a massive amount of countries who claim that we did so many things wrong in our past history. If you talk about Western Europeans, what they did in other parts of the world, which they called colonies. So I'm now really taking a grand perspective, and we start to get into philosophics and things like that. But going back to reality, it's simply not going to work unless you have the major parties on board. And talking about the sanctions in this particular case, I'm not sure that they don't work. It's too quick it's too soon to note. Part of the problem why Putin is so far continuing to do with what he's doing, although it's already very interesting to see that if you really look at it, he's changed perspective. His original aim was to denazify Ukraine, to establish a regime in Kiev, which would be very much listening to Moscow, which was the previous one before 2015, maybe annex the Donbass and the Crimea and a certain part of the southern part of Ukraine, but certainly make, completely delete and destroy Ukraine as a nation. The fact that they are now saying, well, we are mainly doing this for the Donbass and for the Crimea and to keep Ukraine, is already giving an impression that that Putin and his people are toning down their demands, because I'm pretty sure that he has never estimated, and actually the Russian Minister of Defense has already said something to that extent a week or two ago. They have totally underestimated the reaction of the West. Putin got away with so much: the Crimea, the Donbass, the stuff in Georgia, and Chechnya, and then think about the MH17 shooting down of the aircraft, the poisoning of diplomats in Britain, the meddling. He got away with so much that he could think he could get away with Ukraine as well, and now he can't. And now he's already stepping back. But the problem is he's dug himself into a hole. He's promised the Russian population, we will smash Ukraine and we will create a greater Russia, which is again the Russia of the Stalinist era or the Tsarist era. He can't go back and say, well, sorry, I'm mistaken and I misjudged, and now there's 20,000 Russians who died for nothing. He won't survive that. So he needs that. That's why he's continuing. That's why he's not really willing to go back to the situation as before. But I'm sure that the sanctions are pretty much hurting. And it's too short to tell whether they hurt sufficiently for him to also relinquish his claims to the Donbass and the Crimea and other stuff. Because again, he has something to show for the 20,000 or the 15,000 or whatever the number is of killed Russian soldiers, if he wants to remain, in control. Because part of the control of Putin is, of course, his police machinery and sort of, killing the opposition or putting them in jail and things like that. But there is also, because of all the misinformation over the last decade or so, there's still a majority of the Russian population who believes him, who thinks he's the great leader that finally, restores Russia to greatness again. And that may be based on lies, but it's still what many people believe. And if he comes back home saying, well, I was mistaken, I underestimated the opposition, I don't know. Anyway, so it's a long story and we're not going into space at all here, but it's too early to say that the sanctions are hurting. Are hurting enough, whatever enough be. I do think they are hurting.
I think they are, but the way I was looking at it was it's not stopping it. And I don't know how long that's going to take to stop it. And we don't really know the damage, like you said, of the extent of what it's doing. See, my whole thing is I would like world peace, but I'm also rational and realistic in the aspect that's not probably going to ever happen. Only because everyone's got their own personal vindictive stuff that they're trying to get across. And at the same time, everyone's got some type of trauma or some type of issue with some country from thousands of years ago. I just don't want that leaking into space. And that's where I
agree.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, there are, again, so far we've been able to do that. And even if you talk about the conflict right now, space has already suffered. I mean, a European mission, which was supposed to use Russian launch vehicles, has been canceled. All sorts of cooperation between NASA and the Russians, the Europeans and the Russians, the Japanese and the Russians has been canceled. But the space station is still operating. And we still have both Russian cosmonauts and American and Western European astronauts on board. And they actually flew 3 Russians recently to the space station. They're going to take back 1 American astronaut. And unless they jail him, which would be a flagrant violation of what we spoke about earlier, the astronauts being envoys of mankind and certainly not being subject to being imprisoned just because they came from a different country. So if that's happening, that thin part of international cooperation in the context of the space station. So far, cross fingers, I'm not sure it's going to last much longer, but so far it has survived. And another thing which makes me a little bit more optimistic when it comes to space as compared to down on Earth is the fact that in space we are all in the same boat, literally. So whether you talk about these anti-satellite tests, which unfortunately we've seen the Russians do recently, we've seen India join recently, the space junk that they create, even though it's just their own satellite and legally speaking you are entitled to destroy your own property, the space junk it creates doesn't discriminate. It can hit also Russian satellites. And as a matter of fact, because of the latest Russian anti-satellite test, whereby they blew up their own space vehicle in order to show, well, we can blow up our own space vehicle, but if need be, we can also blow up an American space vehicle. The debris came dangerously close to the space station. And there are certain procedures on the space station which dictate that if the danger of an actual hit is too large, in the area of a few percentages or something like that, the astronauts need to move to whatever vehicle is docked to the space station at that moment to be ready to take off the moment that it actually starts hitting. So it's they have to go into the lifeboat, you can almost say. 3 of the people that had to go into the lifeboat, or 2 of them, were Russian cosmonauts. So the Russian anti-satellite tests also threatened the lives of Russian cosmonauts because they happened to be on the space station. And in that sense, again, everyone is in that same boat together. So that gives me a glimmer of hope that we might be able to avoid exporting terrestrial conflicts to the full extent to outer space, which is basically what you were saying, I believe.
I kind of still think, I guess I'm trying to tackle the angle of, I think all these things work because it is a little bit too new. Once space normal or space settlement and going up into space starts becoming like something that you can just do whenever you feel like it, much like driving your car to the store. If it ever gets to that capability, then it's going to change. You're going to have more of these kind of fears and these hypotheticals start becoming more of a reality. I think everything works now because everything is still too new. It's like toddlers don't fight until they start getting that testosterone or whatever whenever they get into high school. Well, how long until it takes everyone to get into high school? The next thing you know, you see this issue.
Yes and no. I mean, the risk is absolutely there. And again, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I were able to,
read my fortune.
Tell you with confidence, it's not going to happen. There will be world peace in space. Obviously, there's no guarantee, and that's part of the problem. We always have to work for peace. It's not something that we should take for granted. On the other hand, there are examples where precisely because of traditional ways of doing things together and building that on legal foundations, latecomers have not taken the step of saying, well, this is none of my business. This was decided before I came here. And now that I have something at stake, I'm going to defend it. They rather want to be joined of the club. And the example I'm thinking of is Antarctica, which is, of course, a very fragile continent, which was in the 50s or before, until the 50s, also subject to territorial claims, different from outer space. There were countries that actually said a pie-shaped part of Antarctica is mine because I established a scientific station there for 20 or 30 or 50 years or whatever. So this is part of Norway or Chile or Argentina or whatever country they came from. And in spite of that, it has been able to, by way of an original treaty in the 1950s, the Antarctic Treaty, and then follow-on treaties, to create a regime whereby it has become so ingrained in the DNA of all states doing something in Antarctica that they need each other, that they want to work together with each other, that they are not going to unilaterally say, I don't care what the Antarctic Treaty says, I'm going to take, whatever happens in my pie of Antarctica as being subject to my authority, and I'm going to decide X. So we have seen that Antarctica is, it's not accidental that Antarctica is the place on Earth which is usually most likened, most compared to the actual environment in outer space. It's almost as hostile as outer space. So again, I'm afraid I can't give you any legal certainty. I'm not going to write you a blank check saying that I'm liable if I'm wrong. But there is some hope that we can achieve a similar way of doing things, which at least raises and raises and raises the threshold for someone saying, screw you, I don't like it anymore. I'm going to follow my direct interest, even if that means breaching, the consensus, and if it means risking a war. The threshold will never be 100%, but you can certainly build it and build it and build it over time. And that's basically what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's great work, especially because you have so much, like we just all talked about. It's just, to me, it gives me an anxiety attack a little bit, only because there's just so many things you have to worry about. But you have a very rational and realistic perspective, especially on the things that you can kind of tell me and things that you just don't know. That, like I said, it's hypotheticals because like it's new ground for everyone. And I
Yes.
really appreciate you for giving me your time and doing the podcast. Is there a place where people can find you, website wise, any other links that you have, Twitter, social media ones?
Yeah, I must say I'm not very I'm not a big Twitter. I'm not on Twitter at all, as a matter of fact. But
Good
I
for
do
you.
have. Yeah, sure. Thanks for confirming that. But of course, in my academic capacity, there's a website at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln at the College of Law where I have my own page, which kind of summarizes my career, but it also gives access to my TEDx talk and a couple of other public talks and TV shows which I participated in. And the other way of getting to much of the same stuff actually is going through my consultancy website, which is black-holes.eu. It's an European company, sort of. So if you go to that website, if you type that in on Google, you will be guided to my website. And also there you can have access to, the type of projects I've been working on as a consultant, but also, the TV shows and the radio shows and the TEDx talk and other stuff that might be of interest to people, as well as those who want to go more into the academic legal research. There's links to a lot of my my actual academic articles, but then you really have to be a law student or a legal buff to be willing to read these articles with all the footnotes, etc. But it's it's there, absolutely.
I'll make sure I link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.